There's a little bit of the disease of the explanation and exposition in Hollywood films. You know, a generic Hollywood films, you spend the first 20 minutes in which people are just blah, 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 telling you the whole backstory and exposition and explain you absolutely everything for them to start the story. It's something I cannot stand.
So one of my biggest gripes with movies and TV shows nowadays is the over-reliance on dialogue to tell a story. Whenever I watch something lately, I feel like I'm waiting for the inevitable moment when two characters sit in a room and just exposit to each other. Whether it's to introduce someone.
This is Katana. She's got my back. I would advise not getting killed by her. Her sword traps the souls of its victims.
To explain what the world is like.
What is the spirit world, Grandma?
Well, it's not a place made up of things you can touch, but it exists nonetheless.
Or to tell us how a character feels.
I really am alone. All alone, forever.
This is not good writing. It's boring and lazy. There's no nuance or subtext, and more often than not, it just makes the dialogue sound awkward and stilted.
I thought your thing was a sword.
We've been hired to stop an interdimensional beast from feeding on those batteries, and I'm gonna stop it with a sword.
It's just swords were your thing.
Alfred Hitchcock used to call these types of films
photographs of people talking.
because to him, they didn't even really count as movies. Instead, he saw them as wasted opportunities. Film is primarily a visual medium, so why make a movie if you're not going to take advantage of that? That's why Hitchcock advocated for what he called pure cinema, the art of conveying a film's narrative through imagery. In other words, what we more commonly refer to as visual storytelling. Of course, this naturally raises the question, how does one tell a story visually? Well, 2021 gave us at least one answer to that question. And I assume you all read the title of this video, so you know exactly what show I'm talking about. Arcane is an insanely good show, and that's not just my opinion. The show has outstanding reviews across the board, and since its release, it's racked up accolade after accolade, most recently culminating in an Emmy for Outstanding Animated Program. It's easily my favorite show of 2021, and is arguably one of the best fantasy series ever. But perhaps most importantly, for the purposes of this video, Arcane is a masterclass in visual storytelling, with almost all of its most memorable scenes being utterly devoid of dialogue. So today, I want to talk about the art of visual storytelling, and specifically, the different visual storytelling techniques Arcane employs to elevate its narrative. To that end, I'll be discussing and dissecting several scenes from the show, some of which have gotten their fair share of attention already, and others which I think could use a little more time in the limelight. Either way, this video will contain spoilers for the first season of Arcane, so if you haven't seen the show already, I highly encourage you to do so before proceeding. But with that out of the way, let's take a look at how Arcane tells a story without telling a story. Production design is the art of creating the cinematic world in which the story takes place. It's a broad term that encompasses almost all aspects of a film's visual production, from the sets the characters inhabit to the very clothes they wear. In animation, it even includes the designs of the characters themselves. Acclaimed production designer Guy Hendricks Dias explained it like this:
Production designer really is there as the eyes of the director, designing and overseeing everything that you see in front of your eyes when you look at a movie. You're there to help select locations, props department, set dressing, costume design, make sure that there's a synergy between the colors and the costumes and the sets that they're going to be on.
In other words, production designers are responsible for the overall aesthetic of a film. And as a result, a film's production design is inherently tied to its narrative, and can usually give us insight into the themes, characters, and world of the film. For example, take a look at the contrasting architectures of Piltover and Zon. The former is a vibrant city raised in the geometric stylings of Art Deco. Its industrial patterns and gilded accents, the very embodiment of wealth and glamour. The latter, on the other hand, is a sickly slum built in the captivating curves of Art Nouveau. Its rebellious asymmetry a return to the unpredictable beauty of nature. Arcane is very much a tale of two cities, and that duality is captured in Fortiche's design choices, with the use of clashing art styles visually portraying Topside and the Undercity as two opposing worlds. In Arcane, a building's facade can tell a story. This insane attention to detail can be seen across all of Arcane's set designs. Whether it's wall decorations emphasizing a boyhood obsession, or whimsical desk clutter revealing daughterly affection, Arcane continuously goes the extra mile, adding personal touches that make the world feel real and lived in. Sometimes entire rooms are designed with a particular character in mind. Silco's office, for example, is filled with ornate furnishings, tapestries, and paintings. And while these touches of luxury would probably feel out of place anywhere else in the Undercity, they make perfect sense for him in particular. See, Silco is a man with a chip on his shoulder. As Christian Link himself explains, Silco has always resented being the dirty little thing, and having Topside look down on him. So while Silco certainly wants the Undercity to be independent, his dream of the nation of Zon is ultimately rooted in a far more basic motivation: the desire for respect. And by making Silco's office, and even his wardrobe, dark reflections of the Piltovian aesthetic, Fortiche shows us, rather than tells us, his need to be seen as an equal. Because in a society as economically stratified as the one we see in Arcane, for a Zonite to dress and furnish their personal space like a Topsider would is a silent challenge to the status quo. Silco's way of saying, anything you can do, we can do better. All of this is to say that Silco's office is more than just a set. It's a carefully designed piece of storytelling that gives us insight into the mind of the character. And this can be said for many of the locations in the series. From Jinx's hideout to Jace's loft, each of them is filled with unique visual details that tell us something about the characters that live there.
Must be an inventor.
Locations can also change over time, and that in itself can be meaningful. For instance, when we first see the last drop, it's depicted in warm orange hues, a stark contrast to the sickly greens that dominate the rest of the Undercity's landscape. This gives the place an almost inviting glow, like a campfire in the night. But after the time skip, we see that the last drop is now the source of the very green glow that once surrounded it, reflecting the moral decay of the lanes under Silco's watch. In other words, what used to be a safe haven from the anarchy of the Undercity is now a prominent part of it. Ultimately, the lesson to be learned here is that good set design is about more than just creating a backdrop for the characters. It's about recognizing that every detail is an opportunity to visually flesh out the world. But sets are just one aspect of production design. I also want to talk about props and how Arcane uses them as part of its visual storytelling. Because Arcane is one of the few shows out there that consistently uses props to symbolically convey themes or important story beats. For example, in episode 3, after the murder of Grayson and her enforcers, we see Silco nonchalantly tossing Marcus a bag of money as compensation. As the coins spill to the ground, they land on Grayson's pooling blood, and the tainted gold serves as both an evocative visual metaphor for the steep cost of Marcus's ambition and a stark reminder of Silco's duplicity. What's more, by attaching meaning to an otherwise mundane object, the writers can then recall it at a later time to remind us of a particular theme or emotion. So, when Marcus poignantly stares at the same bloody coin after the 7-year time skip, we know that he is reliving this specific moment, and we can feel the guilt and regret he carries with him without needing to be told about it. This type of setup and payoff can be seen throughout the series. Vi's stuffed rabbit, for instance, is meaningfully introduced in episode 1 and sets up this sequence just 1 episode later.
You know, Powder, what makes you different makes you strong. Always remember that, okay?
Vi says nothing here about her plans to turn herself in, but because we have a rough idea of what the rabbit represents, we can read the subtext behind her actions, just as Vander does in the final scene of the episode. Similarly, because Jace's crystal is consistently portrayed throughout episode 2 as an item with deep symbolic value, we can instantly intuit the morbid context of this scene when we see this shot. Because we know that Jace would never leave this bracelet behind unless he was ready to throw in the towel. Now, in both of these examples, the props in question have highly symbolic meaning, determined in part by their emotional relationship to the characters. But a prop doesn't need to be some deep significant symbol to be effective as a narrative tool. Not every prop needs to be the spinning top from Inception or the origami unicorn from Blade Runner. Sometimes the inherent nature or design of a prop can allow us to make simple inferences that don't rely on visual metaphors, like the way Jinx's whimsical weapon designs indicate a childish personality, or the way the uneaten sandwiches in Jace's apartment suggest that he might be a bit of a workaholic. Props are incredibly versatile tools, and they highlight how production design can be used to convey important themes or ideas, whether it's in the form of a well-dressed set, a thoughtfully placed prop, or even deliberately designed costumes. Good production design can often do the work of several lines of exposition, so long as you're willing to trust your audience to put the pieces together.
I need to speak with one of the inmates.
At the start of episode 5, there's a fun little scene between Caitlin and Vi in Stillwater Prison. At this point, the two characters have just met, and Caitlin's questioning isn't exactly going as planned. Vi is hostile and uncooperative. As the framing here suggests, Caitlin is essentially talking to a wall. But just when it seems like the conversation is going nowhere, something happens that changes the dynamic of the scene.
Does this mean anything to you?
Where did you get this?
The line in the screenplay for this moment reads that Caitlin decides to trust Vi, and we see that decision when Caitlin shares her evidence, a moment which Fortiche beautifully highlights with some well-placed symbolism, with Caitlin metaphorically crossing over a proverbial line in the sand. This is the catalyst for Vi's sudden mood change. But the interesting thing is that just a few moments later, Caitlin also says this.
In what mad world would I trust someone like you?
Someone like me?
Huh. What do we make of this? In a tweet, the writer behind this scene, Amanda Overton, explains the apparent contradiction, stating that it may seem odd that I wrote Caitlin decides to trust in the same scene where she famously says, "In what mad world would I trust someone like you?" I think people say what they've been conditioned to believe far easier than their true feelings. Now, I bring all this up because I think there are some important lessons to be learned here. For one, this scene shows us that actions really do speak louder than words. After all, as Overton points out, Caitlin's words in this scene are nothing more than a socially constructed facade. But more importantly, as a corollary matter, we also learn that having a character act, move, or behave a certain way is an effective way of visually portraying who they are or what they're feeling. In other words, action reveals character. In this particular case, the act of sharing evidence visually conveys that Caitlin has decided to trust Vi, which in turn tells us something about Caitlin as a person. This is one of the reasons Arcane's characters feel so real and well developed. A lesser show would have probably just had a character say exactly what they were feeling.
I'm trusting you. Don't make me regret it.
But Arcane never feels the need to spoon-feed us information. Instead, it just lets its characters act and react and trusts us to figure out what those actions mean. In his 2012 TED Talk on the art of storytelling, Pixar veteran Andrew Stanton champions a similar approach.
Storytelling without dialogue, it's the purest form of cinematic storytelling. It confirms something I really had a hunch on, is that the audience actually wants to work for their meal. They just don't want to know that they're doing that. I first started really understanding this storytelling device when I was writing with Bob Peterson on Finding Nemo, and we would call this the unifying theory of 2 + 2. Make the audience put things together. Don't give them 4, give them 2 + 2.
The result of this is that we as the audience get to learn about the characters not through inorganic dialogue, but in the same way we would get to know people in real life, by just spending time with them. Caitlin never tells us that she's a caring, empathetic person, but we see it through her actions. From the way she shows compassion to a complete stranger, to the way she gives up her gun without hesitation to save Vi's life. Okay, let's take a look at a slightly more complex example of action as storytelling. This is probably my favorite scene in the entire series, and it's easily one of the best instances of visual storytelling Arcane has to offer. In this scene, we see Jinx return to the ruins of her childhood hideout. She fires up the old boxing machine Vi used to practice on when they were kids, and she proceeds to make her best effort to beat her sister's high score, all while reliving the trauma of what she perceives to be Vi's abandonment. When she ultimately fails in her endeavor, she lashes out in anger. But why? Why does this mean so much to her? What do Jinx's actions tell us about her character? As it turns out, the answer requires us to think about everything we know regarding Jinx as a person up until this point, and maybe even beyond. So here is my interpretation, in a subsection I'd like to dub The Deep Dive. Mostly so I'll have an excuse to ramble for a couple of minutes without too much judgment. So here goes. I believe the boxing scene is all about Jinx's arrested development. It's a pointed illustration of her long-standing need for external validation, and it's meant to show us that at this point in time, Jinx isn't fully Jinx yet.
What the hell are you talking about?
Alright, let me explain myself. At the start of the show, we're shown that Powder is a girl with a warped view of what constitutes self-worth. This is ultimately a result of the city's rampant social inequality. After all, had Powder been born in the ivory towers of Piltover, she would have been hailed as a prodigy for her inquisitive mind and knack for invention. But instead, Powder is a child of the Undercity, a place where physical prowess is the law of the land, and genius like hers goes tragically unnoticed. So instead of scientists and scholars, Powder grows up surrounded by people who idealize the notion of being tough and combative, everything she is not.
She made a mistake.
Name one time she hasn't.
She's young.
Don't bullshit me. We're twice the person at half her age.
This instills a feeling of inferiority in Powder, and it nurtures what will eventually become her two core character flaws: her inability to accept herself
I'm not a fighter.
You don't have to be.
And her almost compulsive need to prove her self-worth.
You're not coming.
I'm not afraid.
It's too dangerous.
I can help!
You're not ready!
I can help them.
After the time skip, we are introduced to Jinx, and at first glance we are led to believe that Jinx is everything Powder wasn't. Strong, capable, and unafraid. But then she makes a mistake, and we begin to see cracks in the armor. Slowly but surely, we see glimpses of Powder's inferiority complex still at work.
I got confused, that's all. Now, he thinks I'm weak. I'm not weak!
And we begin to realize that maybe Jinx hasn't changed that much after all. Then, in this episode, we see Jinx suffer yet another setback. And based on her past behavior, we can guess that she will seek out some way to overcompensate for her perceived failure. Just like she did in episode 3.
It worked! Did you see me? My monkey bomb finally worked!
And in episode 4.
That's me!
Half a dozen enforcers dead! Enforcers dead!
Yeah.
A building blown to pieces!
Oh, yeah.
All of this puts her actions in this scene into perspective. It becomes immediately obvious that this isn't just about some sisterly rivalry. To Jinx, it's a matter of self-validation. It's a way to prove to herself that she's no longer Powder.
It's Jinx now. Powder fell down a well.
And yet this crippling insecurity at the heart of Jinx's character, this incessant need to prove herself, is unmistakably Powder. So once again we have a contradiction between what a character says and what they do. Jinx proclaims Powder is dead, she pretends that she has put the past behind her, and yet her behavior says otherwise. So we begin to see that maybe the persona of Jinx is just a facade, a mask adopted in self-deception by a girl who is desperate to forget her trauma. Thematically, I think this interpretation fits. It's the reason why Silco says this later in the episode.
You need to let Powder die, so the fear of pain will no longer control you.
And it's the reason the season ends with the symbolic act of Jinx choosing the Jinx chair. Because it's not until this moment that Jinx is truly born. Before this, the Jinx we see on screen is a character at war with herself, stuck in an identity crisis between the person she once was and the person she is becoming. And there's some subtle details indicating that this is the case. For example, the fact that the name Jinx itself is just an attempt at reclaiming a traumatizing word from Powder's past.
Why did you leave me?
Because you're a Jinx! Do you hear me? Milo was right!
No.
Alright, I'm gonna go cry.
Or the fact that Jinx puts the name Powder onto the arcade machine at the end of the scene, despite Jinx being a much better fit for the 4-letter slots. In the end, the boxing scene, like the baptism scene with Silco later in the episode, is meant to show us that Jinx is still a work in progress, that Powder is still evolving into the Jinx we know from the game. Now, you may or may not agree with my interpretation of the boxing scene, and you know what? That's okay. Because what's truly impressive about this scene is that it lends itself to such a granular degree of analysis at all. By omitting dialogue and instead showing us a character in action, Arcane forces us to think about the meaning behind those actions, to interpret what we're seeing, to engage with the medium and draw our own conclusions. Arcane doesn't give us 4, it gives us 2 + 2. And in doing so, it showcases how one can use an otherwise mundane event to create a powerful character moment. So next time you want to show something meaningful about your characters, have your characters act in ways that manifest their beliefs and emotions, their strengths and weaknesses. If your character is angry and impulsive, show them picking a fight. If they're depressed and hopeless, show them on the brink of giving in to despair. If they're good with machines, show them tinkering with something. And if they're an Ogre 2 level sniper, show them handling a gun. Arcane is a show with breathtaking cinematography. Almost every episode is packed with these striking, inventive shots that give the show a distinct cinematic feel not often seen in television series. But it also goes deeper than that. The cinematography in Arcane doesn't just help the show look good, it also plays a crucial role in the storytelling. This is something I alluded to earlier in the video, when I talked about how the composition of this shot helps convey the contentious nature of Caitlin and Vi's initial meeting. But there are plenty of other examples. For instance, take a look at this shot of Silco. What does the framing of this shot tell us about his character? The answer requires us to consider the context of the scene, as well as the reasoning behind the shot composition. Here, the use of a wide shot indicates to us that the director wanted to draw attention to the surrounding environment. And this scene is all about Silco gaining a foothold into Piltover's police force by corrupting Marcus.
Oh, don't look so concerned. I'm about to make your day.
With both these things in mind, we can infer that the imagery of these tendrils slowly expanding with Silco at their center is a sort of metaphor for the spread of Silco's toxic influence throughout the city. This is a little composition trick Arcane likes to use, framing characters alongside symbolic environmental elements to emphasize something meaningful about their story arcs. Let me show you what I mean. In episode 2, we get this wide shot of Vi and Vander by the bridge to Piltover. Now, most shows are content to shoot a conversation between two characters in the traditional shot, reverse shot format. So why did Fortiche decide to give us a wide here? And why does this pillar take up so much of the screen? We get the answer later in the scene when Vander asks Vi this question.
I know you want to hurt the Topsiders for what they've done to us. But who are you willing to lose?
See, the underlying conflict here is that Vi's vendetta against Piltover is blinding her to the fact that an all-out war would jeopardize the very lives she's trying to protect. This shot encapsulates that in a single image. Vi is framed with her back to the shrine erected for those who died during Vander's uprising, showing us that she's metaphorically blind to the consequences of war. Similarly, after the Council's verdict in episode 2, we get several shots of Jace that seem to trap him within his environment, illustrating how his expulsion from the Academy has left him in an entirely different kind of prison.
What will you do?
Join the Talus Hammer business, I guess?
You can't do that.
No, I can't.
Let's take a look at a couple more examples. In this scene, the framing in this shot illustrates how Jace's growing political career is slowly eclipsing his friendship with Victor. This is one of my favorite plot points in the series because it's something that silently builds up over the course of the season, mostly through subtle camera work and visual cues. In this medium shot from the following episode, for instance, the framing not only creates a visual separation between both characters, but it also emphasizes their increasingly diverging priorities. Jace is featured in the background, preoccupied with his appearance, while Victor is in the foreground, absorbed in his research. The two never look directly at each other, and through composition alone we can tell that a rift is forming between them. Another cool instance of framing can be seen earlier in this episode, when Marcus confronts Silco about Jinx's reckless behavior.
I lost 6 officers! 6!
She pushed it too far this time.
The council's up.
For the most part, Silco lets Marcus vent his frustrations, but when Marcus begins to threaten him,
what if I'm not interested in playing along?
The camera angle shifts as Silco reminds him who's really in charge. Now, Silco's silhouette sits in the foreground between the camera and Marcus, partially obscuring the shot. The lack of space creates a cramped, almost claustrophobic feeling that showcases just how little agency Marcus actually has in this situation. This technique of dirtying the frame by obscuring the image with objects in the foreground also mimics the sensation of being watched, which emphasizes the subject's vulnerability. All of this works together to convey the feeling that Marcus is trapped and powerless. He may be trying to act tough, but he doesn't have any leverage here.
We've accomplished a lot together, Marcus. Sheriff. And there is more yet to achieve.
Okay, let's do one more example. In episode 6, we see a frustrated and disillusioned Jace making a push to have Heimerdinger kicked off the council. And it's the combination of both camera movement and framing that help convey the transfer of power throughout the scene. When we begin, Heimerdinger is the only council member shot at center frame.
In a world that cannibalized itself over power and pride. But we've forgotten. Loosened our morals in favor of comfort and convenience. Traded honor for prestige. We were once one tribe. Now we are houses divided.
But as Jace begins to question his leadership, we see the camera begin to shift sideways, pushing Heimerdinger towards the right of the screen and Jace closer to the center. It's a subtle shift, but by the time Jace calls for the vote, he is at the center, and Heimerdinger is so far right, he's almost off screen. We can find these types of purposeful shots throughout the show, and they really highlight the versatility of the camera as a storytelling tool. A close-up can indicate intimacy, a wide shot can convey isolation, Dutch angles can be used to express psychological tension, and low-angle shots can illustrate power dynamics. A tilt can highlight the grandeur of a city or the importance of an object. A steady shot connotes control, a shaky one, chaos. The list goes on and on. Arcane shows us that cinematography is intricately tied to a film's narrative, that each shot is an opportunity to immerse the audience in a way that dialogue simply can't replicate, and that the ability to write with the camera is often what elevates a show from good to great. If it wasn't painfully obvious by now, I love Arcane. It's a show that flaunts its craftsmanship from the moment the opening scene fades in. A labor of love that triumphantly shatters any preconceptions of what animated television is capable of. From the sumptuous visuals to the nuanced writing, you would be hard-pressed to find any show, let alone a video game adaptation, that could match the sheer quality and attention to detail that Arcane exhibits from episode to episode. I originally wanted to end this essay on a memorable note, maybe throw in some clever callbacks to one of the points I made earlier in the video. But now that I'm here, after months of researching and writing and analyzing each episode for what seems like the 100th time, I find myself really only wanting to say one thing. Thank you. Thank you to all the artists and musicians and writers and creators that help make this series a reality. Even now in 2023, animation is still often looked down upon as a medium for children, and it's works like this that prove that it can be so much more than that.
Therefore, it's been a great year for animation, because animation is cinema. Animation is not a genre for kids, it's a medium. This is an art form that has kept being kept commercially and industrially in the kids' table for so long, and it really is a mature, expressive, beautiful, complex art form.
If people take anything away from this video at all, I hope it's a newfound appreciation for the insane amount of work and attention to detail that went into making this show. And I say that knowing full well that I barely scratched the surface. With all that being said, thank you for watching. I hope you found this was worth your time. This is my first video essay on this channel, and I want to make this a place where I can express my thoughts on my favorite movies, video games, and anime in a somewhat similar format. I don't plan on all my videos being this pedantic, but I do plan on making more long-form video essays. So if you liked what you saw here, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing for more. And I think that's it. I'll catch you guys on the next one.